Colorado Territory, Christmas Eve, 1880. The snow falls heavy and unforgiving across the frontier town of Cedar Ridge, where mercy is scarce and judgment comes swift. On this holiest of nights, Maisie Tolland finds herself cast into the bitter, cold, her shame visible beneath her worn coat, her pregnancy a scandal that no decent family will abide. 7 months along, and with nowhere to turn, she walks the frozen streets until her strength gives out near the old wooden bridge. That's when the sleigh appears through the swirling snow, driven by a man the town whispers about but rarely sees. Gideon McAllister, the reclusive cattle baron who built an empire and then disappeared into his own grief. He stops, looks down at her trembling form, and speaks the words that will change both their lives forever. But what happens when an act of Christmas mercy becomes something neither of them expected? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The winter of 1880 came early to Colorado Territory, settling over Cedar Ridge like a wool blanket soaked in ice water. The town huddled against the foothills of the Rockies, its wooden buildings creaking under the weight of accumulated snow that had been falling since Thanksgiving. Christmas Eve found the residents barricaded behind frosted windows, their oil lamps casting amber pools of light that seemed to push back against the darkness, pressing in from all sides. Maisie Tolland pressed her face against the cold glass of the boarding house window, watching the last of the evening's churchgoers hurry past with their heads bent against the wind. Her breath fogged the pain as she traced patterns in the condensation, a habit she'd carried since childhood that her mother had always scolded her for. But her mother wasn't here to scold her anymore. Neither was anyone else who might have cared. At 23, Maisie had the kind of beauty that small towns both treasured and feared. Auburn hair that caught the light like copper wire, green eyes that seemed to hold secrets, and a spirit that had never quite learned to bend the way proper ladies were supposed to. That spirit had gotten her into trouble before, but never like this. Never trouble that showed itself so plainly. Beneath her increasingly tight corset, never trouble that made respectable women cross the street when they saw her coming. 7 months. 7 months since the night that changed everything, when Thomas Whitmore had whispered promises in her ear under the harvest moon and left her believing that love was enough to conquer the judgment of a small town. He'd been gone by November, headed east to Denver with talk of business opportunities and vague promises to send for her. The last letter had come 6 weeks ago, and it hadn't mentioned marriage at all. Thomas Whitmore's final letter lay folded in her reticule, the paper worn soft from repeated readings. The ink had begun to fade, but the words still cut deep. My dear Maisie, circumstances have changed considerably since my arrival in Denver. I've been presented with opportunities that require careful consideration of my future associations. I trust you understand the delicate nature of my position. The rest dissolved into meaningless platitudes about wishing her well and hoping she would find happiness elsewhere. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house keeper, climbed the narrow stairs, with the heavy tread of a woman carrying more than her own weight. Maisie knew that sound, had been dreading it for weeks, as her rent payments grew thinner and the whispers grew louder. The knock on her door came soft but insistent. Miss Tolland, we need to have ourselves a talk. Maisie smoothed her skirts and opened the door to find Mrs. Henderson's weathered face set in lines of uncomfortable determination. Behind her stood Reverend Matthews, his thin frame draped in black wool that made him look like a walking shadow. His pale eyes held the kind of righteous certainty that Maisie had learned to fear. Evening, Miss Tolland, the Reverend said, removing his hat to reveal thinning grey hair. I'm afraid we need to discuss your situation. The word hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Maisie's hand instinctively moved to her rounded belly, a protective gesture that had become as natural as breathing. What situation would that be, Reverend? She asked, though they all knew the answer. Mrs. Henderson shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Maisie, you know I've tried to be patient. You've been a good tenant these past 2 years, quiet and respectful. But the other guests are talking, and some of the church ladies have been by." "What Mrs. Henderson is trying to say," Reverend Matthews interrupted, "is that your continued presence here has become problematic for the moral standing of this establishment, you understand." Maisie felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the winter wind rattling the windows. "I've paid my rent. I've caused no trouble. Your very existence here is trouble enough," the Reverend said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "A woman in your condition, unmarried, living among decent folk. It sends the wrong message to our young people. It suggests that such behavior can be overlooked, even accommodated. And on Christmas Eve, no less," Mrs. Henderson added, wringing her hands. "It just doesn't seem fitting, having you here during the holiest time of year." The irony wasn't lost on Maisie. Christmas Eve, the night celebrating the birth of a child, to an unwed mother, and she was being cast out for the same circumstance. But she'd learned that pointing out such contradictions only made righteous people angrier. "Where exactly am I supposed to go?" she asked quietly. Reverend Matthews straightened his narrow shoulders. "That should have been a consideration before. You chose this path. There are institutions in Denver that handle cases like yours, places where you can have the child and make appropriate arrangements for its future." "Arrangements?" The word came out sharper than Maisie intended. "Adoption, Miss Tolland. There are good Christian families who would welcome a child, despite the circumstances of its conception. You could start fresh somewhere else, free from the burden of your choices, the burden of her choices, as if the child growing inside her was nothing more than an inconvenience to be disposed of, rather than a life she already loved with fierce protectiveness." "I won't be giving up my child," she said firmly. Mrs. Henderson's face softened slightly. "Maisie, be practical. How will you support yourself? What kind of life can you give a baby with no husband, no family, no means?" It was a fair question, one that kept Maisie awake most nights, but the answer remained the same. "I'll find a way." "Your stubbornness won't put food on the table or clothes on that child's back," Reverend Matthews said. "Pride is a sin, Miss Tolland, and yours is leading you toward destruction." "What's sinful?" Maisie said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Is turning away a woman with child on Christmas Eve?" The Reverend's face flushed red above his dark collar. "Don't you dare quote scripture to me, young woman. Your situation is the result of your own moral failings, not some divine test." Mrs. Henderson stepped between them, her hands raised. "Now let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Maisie, I'm truly sorry, but you'll need to gather your things. Tonight." "Tonight?" Maisie's voice cracked despite her efforts to remain composed. "In this storm? I'm afraid so. The other guests, well, they've made their feelings clear. If you're still here come morning, I'll lose their business, and I can't afford that." Maisie looked at the woman who had been kind to her for 2 years, who had brought her soup when she was sick and never complained about her inability to always pay rent on time. Now Mrs. Henderson couldn't even meet her eyes. "I see," Maisie said quietly. "How long do I have?" "An hour should be sufficient to pack your belongings," Reverend Matthews said. "I'll wait to ensure you leave the premises." The cold thing in Maisie's chest spread outward, numbing her fingers and toes. She nodded once, not trusting her voice, and closed the door. Her few possessions fit easily into a single carpet bag, a spare dress, some undergarments, her mother's silver hairbrush, and a small leather Bible that had been her father's. At the bottom of the bag, she placed Thomas's letter, though she couldn't say why, perhaps as a reminder of how thoroughly she'd misjudged a man's character. The threadbare shawl her grandmother had knitted lay across the foot of the bed, its blue wool, faded but still warm. Maisie wrapped it around her shoulders, feeling the familiar comfort of its worn softness. It had been her constant companion through childhood winters, and now it would have to see her through whatever came next. As she descended the narrow stairs, for the last time, her hand trailing along the smooth banister, Maisie felt the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. The night she'd trusted Thomas Whitmore, the morning she'd discovered her condition, the weeks of hoping he would return to make things right, the gradual realization that she was truly alone. Mrs. Henderson waited in the foyer, holding an envelope. "Your deposit," she said without looking up. "It's not much, but—" Maisie took the money, $3 and some change, and tucked it into her reticule. It wouldn't last long, but it was something. "I'm sorry, Maisie," Mrs. Henderson whispered. "Truly I am." Reverend Matthews opened the front door, letting in a blast of frigid air that made the oil lamps flicker. Snow swirled into the entryway, melting immediately on the wooden floor. "May God have mercy on your soul," he said, as Maisie stepped past him into the night. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded as final as a coffin lid. Maisie stood on the covered porch for a moment, adjusting her shawl and trying to decide which direction to walk. The storm had worsened while she packed, and the wind drove snow horizontally across the empty street. Behind the frosted windows of the boarding house, she could see the warm glow of the parlor where the other guests would be gathered, probably sharing hot cider and Christmas stories. The life she'd been part of until an hour ago, now closed to her forever. Maisie pulled her shawl tighter and stepped into the storm, her boots crunching through snow that was already ankle-deep. She had no destination in mind, no plan beyond putting distance between herself and the judgment of Cedar Ridge. But as she walked, feeling the first sharp pains that might signal the beginning of her labor, she began to understand that this Christmas Eve would end in only two ways, with shelter or with death. The thought should have terrified her, but instead, it brought a strange kind of peace. At least the choice would be taken out of her hands. The snow fell with the relentless determination of a creature hunting prey, each flake adding to the white shroud that was slowly burying Cedar Ridge. Maisie's footsteps disappeared behind her, as quickly as she made them, leaving no trace of her passage through the empty streets. The wind howled between the buildings like a living thing, searching for any gap in her defenses, finding plenty. Her threadbare shawl provided little protection against the elements, but she clutched it closer anyway, her numb fingers struggling to maintain their grip. The carpetbag in her other hand felt heavier with each step, though it contained so little. Everything she owned in the world, and it weighed no more than a good Sunday dinner. The town looked different in the storm, smaller somehow, as if the blizzard was compressing it down to its essential elements. The general store stood dark and shuttered, its painted sign creaking in the wind. The saloon showed a sliver of warm light beneath its doors, but Maisie knew better than to seek shelter there. A woman in her condition would find no mercy among men deep in their cups, especially on Christmas Eve. She passed the church where Reverend Matthews preached his sermons of judgment and righteousness. Even God's house was locked tight against the storm, or perhaps against her. The irony cut deep, turned away from shelter on the very night when the Christ child had been born in a stable because there was no room in the inn. The pain in her back that had been nagging at her for days chose that moment to sharpen into something more urgent. Maisie paused, one hand pressed against the small of her back, the other cradling her belly. "Not now," she prayed silently. "Please, not now." But babies came on their own schedule, caring nothing for convenience or circumstance. She felt a warm wetness between her legs and knew with cold certainty that her body was preparing for birth, whether she was ready or not. The old wooden bridge lay ahead, spanning a creek that was probably frozen solid by now. In summer, children played in the shallow water while their mothers did washing on the banks. Tonight, it looked like the edge of the world, disappearing into swirling white nothingness. Maisie made it halfway across before her knees gave out. She sank onto the snow-covered planks, her bag tumbling beside her, and for the first time since leaving the boarding house, she allowed herself to cry. The tears froze on her cheeks almost instantly, adding their own small cruelty to the night's collection. She'd heard stories about people found frozen in the snow, peaceful expressions on their faces as if they'd simply gone to sleep. It didn't seem like such a terrible way to die, especially if the alternative was bleeding to death in childbirth with no one to help. At least here, someone would find her come spring. At least her baby wouldn't have to live as a bastard in a world that had no patience for such children. The sound of sleigh bells came first, distant and musical above the wind's howl. Maisie lifted her head, wondering if her mind was playing tricks on her. But the sound grew closer, accompanied by the steady rhythm of horses' hooves muffled by snow. Through the curtain of falling snow, a dark shape materialized. A sleigh pulled by two massive draft horses, their breath steaming in the frigid air. The driver was little more than a silhouette hunched against the weather, but something about his stillness suggested he'd seen her. The sleigh slowed, then stopped a few feet away. The horses snorted and stamped, eager to be moving again, but the driver held them steady with gentle words spoken too softly for Maisie to hear over the wind. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Maisie remained on her knees in the snow, too exhausted and cold to feel embarrassed by her position. The man on the sleigh studied her with what felt like careful assessment, as if he were solving a problem that required delicate handling. Around his neck, barely visible beneath his heavy coat, hung a thin gold chain. The way he touched it absently, as if seeking comfort from its presence, spoke of grief worn smooth by long habit. Whatever hung from that chain, a ring, a locket, some token of loss, it had been his companion for years. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, but tempered with something that might have been kindness. "You appear to be in some difficulty." Maisie tried to answer, but her teeth were chattering too violently to form words. She nodded instead, a jerky motion that sent snow cascading from her shawl. The man climbed down from the sleigh with surprising grace for someone of his size. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair silvered at the temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of long hours spent squinting into sun and wind. His clothes were well made but practical, a cattleman's garb rather than a dandy's finery. "How long have you been out here?" he asked, crouching down to her level. Up close, she could see his eyes were brown, the color of coffee or rich earth, and they held a weariness that matched her own. Not long," she managed through chattering teeth. "An hour, maybe." He glanced at her condition, his gaze neither judgmental nor pitying, simply matter-of-fact. "Are you hurt? Besides the cold, I mean." Maisie felt another cramp tighten across her belly and pressed her lips together until it passed. I think the baby might be coming." Something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or recognition of a crisis that required immediate action. He stood and looked around at the empty street, the shuttered buildings, the complete absence of help or shelter. "My name is Gideon McAllister," he said, as if proper introductions mattered even in a blizzard. "And unless I'm much mistaken, you're about to become a mother, whether we're ready for it or not." Maisie had heard the name, of course. Everyone in Cedar Ridge knew about Gideon McAllister, though few had actually seen him in recent years. He'd built a cattle empire that stretched from the foothills to the eastern plains, accumulating wealth and influence with the single-minded determination of a man who understood that power was the only protection against a hostile world. But then his wife had died, and their stillborn child with her, and Gideon McAllister had retreated to his ranch in the Pine Hills like a wounded animal seeking a dark place to heal. The townspeople whispered about him sometimes, how he'd become a ghost in his own empire, leaving the day-to-day operations to his foreman while he nursed his grief in solitude. Now, here he was, solid and real, and offering help when the rest of the world had turned its back on her. "You don't understand," she said, forcing the words past her chattering teeth. I can't. People will talk." A bitter smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Let them talk. They've been talking about me for 3 years. I've learned to live with it. Another contraction seized her, stronger this time, and Maisie doubled over with a gasp that turned into a sob. When it passed, she found Gideon's coat draped around her shoulders and his strong hands helping her to her feet. "We can sort out the complications later," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Right now, you need warmth and shelter, and I have both in abundance." He helped her into the sleigh, settling her against fur-lined cushions that felt like heaven after the cold wooden planks of the bridge. Her carpet bag went onto the floor at her feet, and then Gideon was climbing up beside her, taking the reins. "With practiced ease, you'll come home with me," he said, as if it were already decided. "Tonight, at least. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." The sleigh lurched forward, the horses eager to be heading toward warmth and feed. As they left the bridge behind, Maisie caught one last glimpse of Cedar Ridge through the snow, a handful of lights huddled against the darkness, small and mean and already fading into memory. She pulled Gideon's coat tighter around herself and tried not to think about what she was trading one kind of uncertainty for another. But as the sleigh carried her into the white wilderness beyond the town, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The possibility that somewhere in this harsh world, mercy still existed. The McAllister ranch emerged from the storm, like something out of a fairy tale, a sprawling log structure that seemed to grow organically from the pine-covered hillside. Warm light spilled from every window, painting golden rectangles on the snow-covered ground, and smoke rose from multiple chimneys to disappear into the swirling white sky. Maisie had expected something grand, given Gideon's reputation, but she hadn't expected it to feel so much like a home. The main house was built of massive logs that had weathered to a rich honey color, with a wraparound porch supported by hand-hewn posts. Smaller buildings dotted the landscape, a barn, a bunkhouse, various outbuildings, all connected by covered walkways that spoke of practical planning for harsh winters. "Easy now," Gideon murmured, more to the horses than to her, as he guided the sleigh up the circular drive. The animals knew they were home and wanted to hurry toward their warm stalls, but he kept them at a steady pace that wouldn't jostle his passenger more than necessary. As they drew closer to the house, Maisie could see the centerpiece that dominated the main room. A massive stone fireplace that rose from floor to ceiling, its hearth large enough to roast an entire steer. Through the front windows, flames danced behind iron grates, sending flickering light across timber walls lined with books and what looked like family portraits. The great hearth, she would learn later, was what everyone called it. Built by Gideon's father when he first claimed this land, it had served as the heart of the McAllister home for over 30 years. Cookfires, family gatherings, business meetings, celebrations and sorrows, all had played out in the warm circle of its light. Gideon brought the sleigh to a stop near the front steps and climbed down, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. Before Maisie could attempt to move, he was at her side, offering his arm for support. "Careful," he said as she struggled to stand. "The steps might be slippery." Another contraction chose that moment to grip her, and she doubled over with a gasp. That turned into a low moan. Gideon's arm went around her waist, supporting her weight until the pain passed. "How far apart are they?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," she admitted. "I haven't been keeping track." The front door opened before they reached it, revealing a woman in her 50s with graying black hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a simple dress covered by a flour-dusted apron, and her dark eyes took in the scene with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to managing crises. "Dios mio," she breathed, then switched to accented English. "Mr. Gideon, what have you brought us?" "Mrs. Garcia, this is Miss Tolland. She needs help, and she needs it now." Elena Garcia had been the McAllister housekeeper and cook for 15 years, arriving as a young widow with excellent references and staying because the work was steady and the pay fair. She'd helped birth foals and calves, tended sick hands, and set bones broken in falls from horses. But it had been 3 years since she'd had a woman in the house, and the sight of Maisie's condition stirred something maternal in her chest. "See, I can see that. Bring her inside quickly before she catches her death." The interior of the house was even more impressive than Maisie had imagined. The main room soared to cathedral heights, with exposed beams that had been carved and fitted by craftsmen who understood their trade. The great hearth dominated one wall, its stones warm to the touch, and its fire crackling with the promise of endless comfort. Furniture was arranged in comfortable groupings, leather chairs that looked soft as butter, a sofa that could accommodate. Her family, low tables made from polished tree stumps, everything spoke of quality and permanence, as if it had been built to last for generations. "Mrs. Garcia, could you prepare the blue bedroom?" Gideon asked, shrugging out of his heavy coat. "And perhaps send Jake for Dr. Morrison if he can make it through the storm." "The doctor is in Denver until after New Year," Mrs. Garcia replied, helping Maisie out of her wet shawl. "But I've delivered babies before. How long since the pain started?" "A few hours, I think," Maisie said, embarrassed to be discussing such intimate matters with strangers. "They're getting stronger." Mrs. Garcia nodded with the confidence of experience. "First baby always takes its time. We have hours yet, maybe all night. Come, let's get you warm and dry." She led Maisie toward a staircase that curved gracefully to the second floor, its banister worn smooth by decades of hands sliding along its length. But before they reached the first step, another contraction seized her, stronger than any before. Maisie doubled over, one hand gripping the newel post, the other pressed against her belly. A sound escaped her that was part gasp, part sob, and she felt wetness spreading down her legs. "Now that," Mrs. Garcia said with grim satisfaction, "is progress. Mr. Gideon, we need hot water, clean towels, and that bottle of whiskey you keep in your study. This baby isn't waiting for morning." Gideon's face had gone pale, but he nodded and strode toward what Maisie assumed was the kitchen. For a man who commanded a cattle empire, he seemed oddly helpless in the face of impending childbirth. "Men," Mrs. Garcia muttered, guiding Maisie to the sofa nearest the great hearth. "They can face down stampedes and blizzards, but one laboring woman sends them running for cover." She helped Maisie settle against the soft cushions, then knelt to remove her wet boots. The fire's warmth felt like a blessing after hours in the sun. A cold, and Maisie found herself relaxing for the first time since leaving the boarding house. "What's your Christian name, mija?" Mrs. Garcia asked gently. "Maisie. Maisie Tolland." "Well, Maisie Tolland, you picked quite a night for this adventure. Christmas Eve babies are special, you know. They bring extra blessings." Maisie managed a weak smile. "I'm not sure how many blessings I have left coming to me." Mrs. Garcia's expression softened. "Oh, child, you have no idea how much blessing is heading your way. Sometimes God's greatest gifts come wrapped in our darkest moments." Gideon returned with an armload of supplies, his movements efficient despite his obvious discomfort with the situation. He set everything on a nearby table, then stood awkwardly near the fireplace, clearly wanting to help, but unsure what to do. "Perhaps you should see to the horses," Mrs. Garcia suggested diplomatically. "Jake can help when he returns from the bunkhouse." "Of course," Gideon said, relief evident in his voice. But as he headed for the door, he paused and looked back at Maisie. "You're safe here. Whatever brought you out in this storm, you're safe now." The words hit her harder than she'd expected. When was the last time anyone had told her she was safe? When had she last felt anything but hunted and judged and alone? "Thank you," she whispered, tears threatening again. He nodded once, then disappeared into the storm to tend his horses, leaving her in the capable hands of Mrs. Garcia and the warm embrace of the great hearth's light. As another contraction built, Maisie closed her eyes and tried to believe that safety was possible, that mercy existed, and that sometimes strangers could become saviors on the coldest night of the year. Christmas morning dawned clear and brilliant, the storm having exhausted itself some time before sunrise. Maisie woke in a bed so soft she initially thought she was dreaming. Feather mattress, down pillows, and quilts that smelled of lavender and cedar. Sunlight streamed through frost-etched windows, casting rainbow prisms across walls paneled in warm pine. The blue bedroom, as Mrs. Garcia had called it, was decorated in shades of sky and cream, with delicate floral patterns that suggested a woman's touch. A rocking chair sat near the window, positioned to catch the morning light, and Maisie could imagine someone sitting there with needlework or a book, watching the seasons change across the mountain landscape. Her baby had arrived just after midnight, a daughter with dark hair and lungs that announced her displeasure at being born into such a cold world. Mrs. Garcia had handled everything with calm efficiency, and now the infant slept peacefully in a makeshift cradle beside the bed, a wooden apple crate lined with the softest blankets Maisie had ever touched. A soft knock interrupted her contemplation. "Come in," she called, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Gideon entered carrying a breakfast tray, his movements careful and deliberate. He'd changed from his storm clothes into clean trousers and a white shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. In daylight, she could see he was probably in his late 30s, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years spent outdoors. "Mrs. Garcia thought you might be hungry," he said, setting the tray on a small table near the window. "She's quite insistent about new mothers eating properly." The smell of fresh biscuits, scrambled eggs and coffee made Maisie's stomach rumble audibly. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the aroma reached her. "That's very kind," she said, suddenly aware of how she must look, hair tangled, face pale from exhaustion, wearing one of Mrs. Garcia's nightgowns that was too large for her smaller frame. Gideon seemed to sense her discomfort. "I'll let you eat in peace. Mrs. Garcia will want to check on you both shortly." But instead of leaving, he found himself drawn to the makeshift cradle. The baby had kicked free of her blanket, revealing tiny fists and feet that moved with the uncoordinated grace of the newly born. "She's beautiful," he said softly, and Maisie heard something in his voice that made her look at him more carefully. "You can hold her if you'd like." The offer seemed to startle him. No, I shouldn't. I might wake her." But his eyes remained fixed on the sleeping child, and Maisie saw longing there so raw it made her chest ache. She remembered Mrs. Garcia mentioning that he'd lost a baby, and suddenly understood the source of his careful distance. "What was your child's name?" she asked gently. Gideon's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, where the gold chain lay hidden beneath his shirt. "Sarah. We were going to call her Sarah. That's a lovely name." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "She would have been born in spring. We had everything ready. The nursery, the cradle my father made, clothes my wife had sewn through the winter. Months." He paused, swallowing hard. "I locked that room after we lost them both. Haven't opened it since." Maisie felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm sorry, I can't imagine." "Don't apologize. If anything, I should be thanking you." He looked up from the baby to meet her gaze. "It's been a long time since this house felt like a home instead of a mausoleum." Before she could respond, the baby stirred and let out a small whimper that quickly escalated to a full-voiced protest. Maisie reached for her daughter, and as she settled the infant against her shoulder, she caught Gideon watching with an expression that mingled wonder and pain. "What will you call her?" he asked. Maisie hadn't given it much thought during the long months of pregnancy, too focused on simple survival to plan for the future. But now, looking down at the perfect little face, one name seemed obvious. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." A smile tugged at the corner of Gideon's mouth, the first genuine expression of pleasure she'd seen from him. "Hope Tolland! It suits her." Mrs. Garcia bustled in then, carrying fresh linens and wearing the satisfied expression of a woman whose work had gone exactly as planned. "Ah, good, you're awake. And how is our Christmas baby this morning?" "Hungry, I think," Maisie said as Hope's whimpers grew more insistent. "Of course she is." Babies born on Christmas Eve always have healthy appetites. It's the blessing of the season. Mrs. Garcia shooed Gideon toward the door. Out with you, Mr. Gideon. New mothers need privacy for feeding. As he left, Maisie caught him glancing back once more at the baby, and she made a mental note to ask Mrs. Garcia about the locked nursery when she had a chance. Over the next few hours, as Maisie ate and rested and learned the rhythm of caring, for a newborn, she began to piece together more of Gideon's story. Mrs. Garcia was a natural storyteller, and while she fussed over both mother and baby, she painted a picture of a man who had once been the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties. So handsome, and such a way with horses, Mrs. Garcia said, adjusting Hope's blanket with practiced hands. But it was Miss Catherine who caught his eye at the harvest dance 5 years ago. Beautiful girl, daughter of a judge from Colorado Springs. They were married the next spring, and so happy. Her voice trailed off, and Maisie could fill in the rest. The pregnancy, the complications, the double loss that had driven Gideon into his current isolation. He blamed himself. Mrs. Garcia continued quietly. Said if he hadn't insisted on expanding the ranch so quickly, if he'd been home more during her confinement, maybe things would have been different. But surely that's not logical. No. But grief doesn't listen to logic, Mija. It builds its own walls and makes its own rules. Mrs. Garcia smoothed the quilt with gentle hands. 3 years he's been living like a ghost in his own house, until last night. Maisie thought about the way Gideon had looked at Hope, the longing and pain, warring in his expression. The nursery he mentioned, is it really still locked? See, 3rd door down the hall, hasn't been opened since the funeral. Jake wanted to clear it out years ago, use it for storage, but Mr. Gideon won't hear of it. Later, when Mrs. Garcia had gone to prepare lunch and Hope was sleeping peacefully, Maisie found herself thinking about that locked room. In her mind, she could see it clearly, a wooden rocking horse gathering dust in a corner, its painted eyes staring at walls that had never heard a child's laughter. She understood something about holding on to grief, about the way loss could become a companion more familiar than hope. But she also understood that sometimes healing required opening doors that had been closed too long, letting light into spaces that had grown too comfortable with darkness. Outside her window, she could see Gideon working with one of his men to clear snow from the barn roof. Even at a distance, there was something different about his posture, as if some burden had shifted during the night. Hope made a small sound in her sleep, and Maisie reached out to touch her daughter's tiny hand. Maybe Mrs. Garcia was right about Christmas Eve babies bringing blessings. Maybe mercy really did come in unexpected packages, wrapped in the darkest moments. And maybe, just maybe, healing was possible for all of them. The days following Christmas blurred together in a rhythm of feeding, sleeping, and slowly healing. Maisie found herself settling into the quiet routine of the ranch with surprising ease, despite her initial protests that she should leave as soon as she was strong enough to travel. Travel where? Mrs. Garcia had asked with the practical directness. That seemed to be her specialty. In the middle of winter, with a newborn baby? Don't be foolish, Mija. And so Maisie stayed, telling herself it was only temporary, only until spring made travel safer. But with each passing day, the McAllister ranch felt less like a refuge and more like the home she'd never really had. By New Year's Eve, she was strong enough to venture downstairs for longer periods. She'd taken to sitting near the great hearth. In the afternoons, Hope nestled in her arms, watching the snow fall beyond the windows while the fire crackled softly behind them. It was during one of these peaceful interludes that Gideon found her, a steaming mug of coffee in each hand. Mrs. Garcia thought you might enjoy this, he said, offering her one of the mugs. She's added some of her special spices. The coffee was rich and warming, with hints of cinnamon and something else she couldn't identify. It's wonderful. Thank you. Gideon settled into the chair across from her, his own mug cradled between his hands. They'd developed an easy companionship. Over the past week, built on shared meals and quiet conversations, but always with careful boundaries that neither seemed willing to cross. "I've been meaning to show you something," he said after a moment, "if you're feeling up to a short walk." Intrigued, Maisie bundled Hope in warm blankets and followed Gideon out into the crisp afternoon air. He led her past the main barn to a smaller building she hadn't noticed before, its windows frosted but glowing with internal warmth. "The ranch office," he explained, pushing open the heavy wooden door, though it's become more of a workshop in recent years. The interior was a fascinating blend of business and craftsmanship. Ledger books and correspondence covered one large desk, while another table held what appeared to be metalworking tools. The walls were lined with maps, cattle brands burned into wooden plaques, and architectural drawings for various ranch improvements. But what drew Maisie's attention was the object dominating the center table, a cattle brand in the shape of an elaborate M, its iron surface polished to a mirror shine. "The McAllister brand," Gideon said, following her gaze. "My father designed it when he first claimed this land 35 years ago. Every head of cattle, every horse, every piece of equipment that belongs to this ranch bears that mark." He picked up the brand iron, its weight familiar in his hands. "I've been working on a new design, something to mark the next generation of the ranch's history." The passion in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just business to him. It was legacy, identity, the physical manifestation of everything his family had built from nothing. "How many head do you run?" Maisie asked, genuinely curious. "Nearly 3,000, spread across 4 different ranges. We supply beef to Denver, Colorado Springs, and half a dozen smaller towns. It's taken 3 decades to build, but now—" He trailed off, setting the brand iron down carefully. "But now what?" Gideon was quiet for a long moment, staring at the maps on the wall. "Now I'm the last McAllister. When I'm gone, all of this goes to—" He shrugged. "I haven't decided. A cousin back east who's never seen a cow, maybe, or the bank." The sadness in his voice made Maisie's chest tighten. She thought about the locked nursery upstairs, the child who would have inherited all this if fate had been kinder. "You could still have children," she said gently. "You're not that old." A bitter smile crossed his face. "I'm 38, and I buried the only woman I ever loved 3 years ago. I'm not sure I have another marriage in me, even if such a woman existed." Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. There was loneliness there, yes, but also a bone-deep weariness that spoke of a man who had given up on certain dreams. "Besides," he continued, turning to study a detailed map of the eastern range, "what woman would want to tie herself to a broken-down rancher with more ghosts than prospects?" "You're hardly broken down," Maisie said before she could stop herself. The words hung in the air between them, charged with implications neither was ready to address. Gideon looked at her sharply, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I mean," she said quickly, "you've built something remarkable here. Any woman would be lucky to—" She stopped, realizing she was only making it worse. "Would she?" His voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes held an intensity that made her breath catch. Even a woman with her own complicated history. They stared at each other across the workshop, the weight of unspoken possibilities settling between them like snow. Hope stirred in Maisie's arms, making soft baby sounds that broke the spell. "We should head back," Maisie said, her voice slightly unsteady. "It's getting cold." As they walked back to the house, Maisie found herself thinking about legacy and belonging, about the ranch that might pass to strangers, and the man who carried his grief like a brand burned into his soul. She thought about the iron M in the workshop, marking ownership and identity across generations, and wondered what it would feel like to belong somewhere so completely. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, she and Gideon and Mrs. Garcia, with Hope sleeping peacefully in her makeshift cradle nearby, Jake Peterson, the ranch foreman, arrived with news from town. "Supply run went fine, boss," he reported, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Garcia. "But there's been talk about Miss Tolland being here." Maisie felt her stomach drop. She'd known this moment would come, had been dreading it, even as she allowed herself to settle into the comfortable rhythm of ranch life. What kind of talk? Gideon's voice was carefully controlled, but Maisie could hear the steel beneath it. Jake glanced uncomfortable at Maisie, then back at his employer. The kind you'd expect. Some folks saying it ain't proper, a single woman staying here, others wondering about the baby's father and why you're harboring. He stopped, clearly reluctant to repeat the exact words. Harboring what, Jake? A woman of questionable virtue, Jake said finally. Reverend Matthews has been particularly vocal about it, says it sets a bad example for the community. Gideon's jaw tightened, and Maisie saw his hand clench into a fist. On the table. I see, and what do the good people of Cedar Ridge propose I should have done? Left a pregnant woman to freeze to death on Christmas Eve? Course not, boss. But they think, well, they think she should move on now. Find other arrangements. The words hit Maisie like a physical blow. She'd known this was temporary, had told herself as much every day, but hearing it spoken aloud made the reality inescapable. I understand, she said quietly, looking down at her hands. I'll make arrangements to leave as soon as you'll do. No such thing, Gideon interrupted, his voice sharp enough to make both Jake and Mrs. Garcia look up in surprise. This is my ranch, my house, and I'll decide who's welcome here. But even as he spoke the words, Maisie could see the conflict in his eyes. The weight of community judgment, the pressure of maintaining his position in a world where reputation mattered more than mercy. The iron brand with its elaborate M seemed to burn in her memory, a symbol of belonging she would never truly share. New Year's Eve arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only came after a week of heavy snows. The ranch lay pristine under a blanket of white, every fence post and tree branch outlined in perfect detail against the brilliant blue sky. Inside the warm sanctuary of the main house, Maisie found herself helping Mrs. Garcia prepare what the housekeeper called a proper celebration dinner. Mr. Gideon hasn't celebrated New Year's since... Mrs. Garcia paused in her kneading of bread dough, her expression growing thoughtful. Well, since before, but this year feels different. Maisie, who was carefully peeling potatoes while Hope dozed in her cradle nearby, understood what the older woman meant. There was something in the air of the house that hadn't been there when she first arrived, a sense of life, returning to spaces that had been too quiet for too long. Mrs. Garcia, she said carefully, may I ask you something? Of course, Mija. The locked room upstairs. The nursery. Has he really never opened it? Mrs. Garcia's hands stilled in the dough. Not once. I clean around it, dust the door frame, but that room, it's like a shrine to what might have been. That can't be healthy. No, Mrs. Garcia agreed, but grief makes its own rules. I've seen it before. People who hold so tight to their pain that they forget how to live. Before Maisie, who could respond, they heard boots stomping on the front porch, followed by the sound of the door opening. Gideon's voice called out, Mrs. Garcia, could you spare a moment? They found him in the main room, snow still clinging to his coat, holding something wrapped in oiled cloth. His cheeks were red from the cold, and his eyes held an excitement she hadn't seen before. I wanted to show you something, he said, unwrapping the object with careful hands. What emerged took Maisie's breath away. It was a wooden cross, roughly the size of her palm, carved with intricate detail that spoke of hours of patient work. The wood was a rich walnut, polished smooth, and the craftsmanship was exquisite. Every line clean, every surface perfectly shaped. My father made this, Gideon said, his voice soft with memory. He wasn't a religious man in the conventional sense, but he believed in the importance of faith, of having something to hold on to when the world seemed determined to break. You. He turned the cross over in his hands, and Maisie could see initials carved into the back. JM to GM. Hold fast to hope. Jacob McAllister to Gideon McAllister, he explained. He gave it to me on my 16th birthday, said every man needed something to remind him of what truly mattered. It's beautiful, Maisie said, meaning it. I've been carrying it in my pocket. For 22 years. Through cattle drives and business deals, my wedding day, and he paused, his throat working, and the day we buried Catherine and Sarah. It's never left my side. Mrs. Garcia had grown very still, watching Gideon with the careful attention she usually reserved for bread rising or sick calves. Something important was happening here, something that went beyond the simple sharing of a family heirloom. But today, Gideon continued, I realized something. My father didn't give me this cross to hold on to the past. He gave it to me to remember that hope is always possible even when it seems impossible. He looked directly at Maisie then, and she saw something in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. I've been thinking about what you said in the workshop, about legacy, about what happens to all this when I'm gone. Gideon, let me finish. His voice was gentle but determined. I've spent 3 years living like a dead man, convinced that my chance for happiness died with Catherine. But these past 2 weeks, watching you with hope, seeing life return, to this house, I think maybe my father's cross was trying to teach me something I wasn't ready to hear. Hope chose that moment to wake with a soft whimper, and Maisie automatically moved to comfort her. As she lifted her daughter, she became aware of Gideon watching them both with an expression that was tender and wondering, and something else she didn't dare name. What are you saying? She asked quietly. Instead of answering directly, he walked to the great hearth and stared into the flames for a long moment. When he turned back, his face held the kind of resolve that had built cattle empires and conquered wilderness. I'm saying that reputation be damned. I'm saying that what people think matters less than what we know to be true. And I'm saying that if you're willing, I'd like you and Hope to stay. Not as guests, not as charity cases, but as, he searched for the right words, as family. The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Garcia had clasped her hands together as if in prayer, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Maisie felt the world shift around her, possibilities reshaping themselves into patterns she'd never dared imagine. The town will never accept it, she said finally. They'll make your life miserable. Let them try. There was steel in his voice. Now the same iron will that had carved a ranch from raw wilderness. I've learned something these past weeks, Maisie. A man can have all the cattle and land in the territory, but if he doesn't have people to share it with, it's just an expensive way to be alone. And if I say yes, if Hope and I stay, what then? Gideon's smile was the first completely unguarded expression she'd seen from him. Then we figure it out as we go, all of us together. Before Maisie could respond, the sound of approaching. Horses drew their attention to the front windows. Through the glass, they could see riders approaching, 3 men on horseback, moving with the purposeful determination of people bringing unwelcome news. Jake's with them, Gideon observed, his expression hardening. And unless I'm mistaken, that's Reverend Matthews and Judge Harrison. Mrs. Garcia crossed herself quickly. On New Year's Eve? This cannot be good news. As the riders drew closer, Maisie caught sight of a 4th figure she hadn't noticed at first. A man in an expensive coat riding a horse that was too fine for local standards. Her blood turned to ice as recognition hit her. Oh, God, she whispered, unconsciously clutching. Hope closer to her chest. What is it? Gideon asked, seeing her reaction. It's Thomas, she said, her voice barely audible. Thomas Whitmore, Hope's father. The wooden cross seemed to grow heavier in Gideon's hand as he watched the approaching riders. Outside, the new Year's Eve sky was darkening toward twilight, and inside, the warm sanctuary they'd built together suddenly felt fragile as spun glass. Well then, he said quietly, tucking the cross back into his pocket, I suppose we're about to find out how much faith is really worth. The riders reached the front porch just as the last light faded from the western sky, their arrival marking the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. The knock on the front door came with the measured authority of men who expected to be admitted without question. Gideon straightened his shoulders, transforming from the gentle man who'd been sharing family stories into the cattle baron who commanded respect across 3 counties. Mrs. Garcia, "Would you mind taking Hope upstairs?" he said quietly, his eyes never leaving the front windows where shadows moved beyond the frosted glass. "Sigh, of course." Mrs. Garcia moved quickly to gather the baby, her maternal instincts, recognizing the need to protect the innocent from whatever storm was about to break. Maisie stood frozen near the great hearth, her hands trembling as the reality of Thomas's presence sank in. She'd known this day might come, had nightmares about it, but seeing him through the window, older, more prosperous-looking, radiating the confidence of a man who'd never faced real consequences for his actions, made her feel 17 again, naive and easily manipulated. "You don't have to face him," Gideon said, moving to stand beside her. "I can handle this." "No." Maisie lifted her chin with a resolve that surprised them both. "He's here because of me. Because of Hope. I won't hide like some shameful secret." The knock came again, more insistent this time. Gideon walked to the door and opened it to reveal exactly what they'd expected. Reverend Matthews in his perpetual black, Judge Harrison in his finest coat, Jake Peterson looking deeply uncomfortable, and Thomas Whitmore. Thomas had changed in the months since Maisie had seen him. His brown hair was now styled in the latest Denver fashion, his mustache precisely trimmed, his clothes expensive enough to announce his improved circumstances to anyone who cared to notice. But his eyes, those warm brown eyes that had once whispered promises under starlight, held a calculating coldness that made her wonder how she'd ever trusted him. "Gentlemen," Gideon said with careful politeness, "this is unexpected. Please come in from the cold." They filed into the main room, bringing with them the sharp bite of winter air and an atmosphere of barely contained tension. Thomas's gaze found Maisie immediately, his expression shifting through surprise, assessment, and something that might have been satisfaction. "Miss Tolland," he said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "You're looking, well, Mr. Whitmore." Her voice was steadier than she'd expected. Judge Harrison, a portly man with silver whiskers and the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room, cleared his throat importantly. "Mr. McAllister, we've come on a matter of some delicacy. Perhaps we could speak privately?" "Anything you have to say can be said in front of Miss Tolland," Gideon replied. "She's a guest in my home." Reverend Matthews' thin lips pursed in disapproval. "That's precisely the problem, Mr. McAllister. Miss Tolland's situation has become a matter of concern for the entire community." "Her situation?" Gideon's voice carried a dangerous edge. Thomas stepped forward then, reaching into his coat to withdraw a folded document. "Perhaps I should explain. You see, Mr. McAllister, Miss Tolland and I have a prior arrangement. A legal arrangement." He held up the paper with a flourish that suggested he'd been practicing the gesture. Even from across the room, Maisie could see official seals and formal script that made her stomach clench with dread. "What kind of arrangement?" Gideon asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected. "A marriage contract," Thomas announced. "Signed and witnessed before my departure to Denver. Miss Tolland is in fact Mrs. Whitmore and has been since last September." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Maisie stared at Thomas in complete shock, her mind reeling. "That's impossible. We were never married. You left without a proper ceremony, perhaps," Thomas interrupted smoothly. "But the contract is perfectly legal. Judge Harrison can verify it." The judge nodded gravely, accepting the document and examining it with theatrical thoroughness. "The signatures appear authentic, and the witnesses are known to me. In the eyes of the law, this constitutes a binding marriage contract." "That's a lie." Maisie's voice cracked with fury and disbelief. "I never signed any such thing." Thomas's smile was cold and predatory. "My dear, you signed many things during our courtship. Love letters, promises. It would be so easy to confuse one document for another, especially for a woman in your emotional state at the time." The implication was clear, and Maisie felt sick as she understood what he'd done. He'd forged her signature, created a false marriage certificate, and was now using it to claim both her and Hope. "Even if such a document existed," Gideon said, his voice deadly quiet, "what gives you the right to abandon your wife for months, then return to claim her like lost property?" "Business," Thomas replied with infuriating casualness. "I had to establish myself in Denver before I could properly provide for a family. Now that I'm engaged to marry Miss Victoria Ashford, daughter of Senator Ashford, you understand, I find myself in need of legitimizing my heir." The casual cruelty of it took Maisie's breath away. He wasn't here for love or even responsibility. He was here because his new fiancée and her powerful family demanded a scandal-free reputation, and acknowledging Hope as his legitimate child would accomplish that while simultaneously disposing of his previous entanglement. "You bastard," she whispered. "Actually," Thomas said with mock cheerfulness, "that would be your child's status if she remains with you unmarried. Whereas, if she comes with her legal father and stepmother, she'll be raised as a proper lady of society." Reverend Matthews stepped forward, his pale eyes gleaming with righteous satisfaction. "You see, Mr. McAllister, this resolves the moral crisis quite nicely. Mrs. Whitmore returns to her legal husband, the child is raised in a proper Christian home, and you're freed from the burden of harboring complications." "And if I refuse?" Maisie asked, though she already knew the answer. Judge Harrison consulted the document again. "The law is quite clear, Mrs. Whitmore. A wife belongs with her husband, and children belong with their father. Mr. Whitmore could compel your return through legal means if necessary. But perhaps that won't be required," Thomas said, his tone becoming falsely gentle. "I'm prepared to be magnanimous about your temporary lapse in judgment. You were frightened, alone, and Mr. McAllister took advantage of your vulnerability. No doubt he promised you things he had no intention of delivering." Gideon's hands clenched into fists, but Thomas continued before he could speak. "Return with me now, and we'll put this unfortunate episode behind us. Victoria is prepared to accept the child as her own. She's quite charitable that way. Hope will want for nothing, will have every advantage society can provide." "And if she refuses?" Gideon asked. Thomas's mask of civility slipped slightly. "Then I'll be forced to take more drastic measures. You see, I've already spoken with certain business associates in Denver. Cattle contracts can be so fragile. A word in the wrong ear, a question about the stability of a ranch owner's personal life, and suddenly buyers find other suppliers." The threat was clear and devastating. Thomas had the connections and influence to destroy Gideon's business, to reduce the empire he'd built to nothing more than empty land and worthless contracts. "Choose carefully, Mr. McAllister," Judge Harrison added. "Your reputation in this community depends on making the right decision." As if summoned by the tension in the room, Mrs. Garcia appeared at the top of the stairs, Hope in her arms. The baby had begun to fuss, her cries cutting through the adult conversation with the pure honesty of infant need. Thomas looked up at his daughter with an expression that held no warmth, only calculating assessment. "Bring her down," he ordered. "It's time she met her father properly." "No." Maisie's voice rang clear and strong across the room. "I won't let you take her." "You don't have a choice," Thomas replied. "She's mine by law, just as you are." But as he reached into his coat again, Maisie caught a glimpse of something that made her blood run cold. Not another legal document. A small pistol, pearl-handled and deadly, positioned where he could reach it quickly if needed. The forged marriage certificate was just the beginning. Thomas had come prepared to take what he wanted by any means necessary, and the law was on his side. The silence that followed Thomas's implicit threat stretched taut as a wire fence in winter. Gideon's eyes had gone cold and flat. The look of a man who'd faced down rustlers and wolves and knew exactly how dangerous cornered predators could be. His hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his hip, where Maisie suddenly realized he might be carrying his own weapon. That's quite an impressive collection of legal documents, Whitmore, Gideon said, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded storms. But I'm curious about something. If Miss Tolland has been your wife since September, why did you wait until now to claim her? Thomas's confident smile flickered slightly. As I explained, business required you to abandon a pregnant woman in winter. Gideon's tone remained conversational, but there was steel beneath it. Or did business require you to wait until you had a more advantageous marriage lined up before dealing with inconvenient previous entanglements? Judge Harrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. The timing is irrelevant. The law is clear. Is it? Gideon walked to his desk and withdrew a leather portfolio. Because I've done some business of my own recently. Correspondence with attorneys. In Denver, inquiries about marriage law, the requirements for valid contracts. He opened the portfolio and withdrew several official-looking documents. It seems there are very specific requirements for marriage contracts in Colorado Territory. Witnesses must be present at the signing, not merely for the ceremony. Both. Parties must acknowledge the contract before a qualified official, and most importantly, he looked directly at Thomas, both parties must sign in the presence of each other and the witnesses. Thomas's face had gone pale beneath his carefully groomed exterior. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating that your document is a forgery, and a poor one at that. Gideon's voice carried the authority of a man who'd spent years negotiating contracts and spotting deception. Miss Tolland never signed any marriage agreement because no such agreement was ever presented to her. Reverend Matthews stepped forward, his thin frame quivering with righteous indignation. Are you calling Judge Harrison a liar? I'm calling Thomas Whitmore a liar and a forger. The judge, I suspect, has been deceived along with the rest of us. Judge Harrison's weathered face flushed red as he examined the document more carefully. Years of legal experience had taught him to recognize authentic paperwork, and under closer scrutiny, something about the signatures didn't feel right. Mr. Whitmore, he said slowly, perhaps you could explain the circumstances under which this contract was signed. But Thomas had moved beyond legal maneuvering. His hand slipped inside his coat, and when it emerged, the pearl-handled pistol caught the firelight like a malevolent star. Enough, he said, his cultured accent slipping to reveal something harder beneath. I've wasted enough time on this charade. Mrs. Garcia, who had been descending the stairs with hope, froze halfway down. The baby's cries filled the sudden silence. A sound of pure innocence in a room that had turned deadly. Put the gun away, Whitmore, Gideon said quietly. There's no need for this. Isn't there? Thomas's eyes had taken on a wild gleam that suggested desperation poorly concealed beneath expensive clothes. You think I've come this far to be denied by some cattle rancher with delusions of heroism? The truth was spilling out now, the careful facade cracking under pressure. This wasn't about love or responsibility, or even social respectability. This was about a man who'd made promises to powerful people and couldn't afford to break them. The Ashfords expect me to present a respectable family, Thomas continued, the gun wavering slightly in his grip. Victoria's father has already announced our engagement to the Denver papers. If word gets out that I abandoned a pregnant woman, that I have a bastard child running around. So, you thought you'd manufacture a legal claim, Maisie said, finding her voice despite her terror. Force me to play the part of the dutiful wife. Raise hope to legitimize your reputation. Exactly. Thomas's smile was ugly now, all pretense stripped away. It was a perfect plan until this complication. He gestured at Gideon with the pistol. But complications can be resolved. Jake Peterson, who had been standing uncomfortably near the door, suddenly stepped forward. Now hold on there, mister. Nobody said anything about guns. Stay back, Thomas snapped, swinging the weapon toward the foreman. This doesn't concern you. But Jake had spent 20 years working cattle ranches, and he recognized the kind of man who would threaten women and children. Like hell it doesn't. Mr. Gideon, you want me to— No, Jake. Gideon's voice was calm but firm. "Let me handle this." He began moving slowly across the room, not toward Thomas, but toward a cabinet near the far wall. His movements were casual, unthreatening, but Maisie could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he kept his hands visible. "You know what your problem is, Whitmore?" Gideon said conversationally. "You think money and connections make you powerful, but real power comes from having something worth protecting." "Spare me the frontier philosophy," Thomas snarled. "I'm leaving here with my wife and child one way or another." "Are you?" Gideon had reached the cabinet now, and he opened it to reveal what Maisie recognized as a gun case. "Because from where I stand, you're a desperate man with a forged document, making threats in my home against people under my protection." Thomas's grip on the pistol tightened. "I'm warning you, and I'm warning you." Gideon's hand closed around something in the cabinet, not a gun, but an object that gleamed with deadly purpose. When he turned, Maisie saw he was holding his father's Colt revolver, the weapon worn smooth by years of use and care. The pistol looked almost alive in his hands, an extension of his will shaped by decades of frontier experience. This wasn't the pearl-handled toy that Thomas wielded like a stage prop. This was a working man's weapon, carried by men who understood that sometimes civilization required the threat of controlled violence. "My father carried this gun for 30 years, Gideon said, his voice taking on the cadence of a man sharing sacred history. "Through Indian raids, cattle wars, and claim jumpers who thought they could take what didn't belong to them, he taught me that a man's word is his bond, and that some things are worth fighting for." "You wouldn't dare," Thomas said, but his voice had lost its confident edge. "Wouldn't I?" Gideon's thumb found the hammer, drawing it back with a click that seemed to echo through the room. "You came into my home with forged papers and threats against a woman and child. In my book, that makes you no different from any other predator." Judge Harrison, who had been watching the confrontation with growing alarm, finally found his voice. "Gentlemen, surely we can resolve this without—" The time for legal resolution passed when this man drew a weapon. Gideon interrupted, never taking his eyes off Thomas. "Now, it's a question of who walks away and who doesn't." Mrs. Garcia, still holding Hope on the stairs, began backing slowly upward, her maternal instincts overriding everything else. The baby's cries had intensified, as if she could sense the violence brewing in the air below. "Listen to me, Whitmore," Gideon continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more menacing than shouting. "You have exactly 10 seconds to put down that toy gun and walk out of my house. After that, I stop being polite." "You don't understand," Thomas said, desperation creeping into his voice. "I can't go back empty-handed. The Ashfords, they'll ruin me. I'll lose everything." "Then you should have thought of that before you abandoned a pregnant woman," Maisie said, stepping forward despite the danger. "Before you forged documents and made threats against innocent people." "Innocent?" Thomas's laugh was bitter and wild. "You think any of this is innocent? You're living in sin with this man, flaunting your bastard child in the face of decent society." "That bastard child," Gideon said quietly, "is worth more than a dozen men like you." The words seemed to break something in Thomas. His face contorted with rage and fear, and Maisie saw his finger tighten on the trigger. "Everybody down!" Jake shouted, diving toward Reverend Matthews, but Gideon was already moving, the Colt rising with practiced speed toward a target that had finally revealed its true nature. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the two men faced each other across the warm sanctuary of the main room, one fighting for power and reputation, the other defending home and family. The sound of Hope's crying filled the air like a prayer, innocent and desperate and pure. And in that sound, Maisie heard everything that mattered. Not law or social convention or the judgment of strangers, but the simple truth that some things were worth any sacrifice to protect. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, ready to tip, toward violence or mercy, toward destruction or salvation. And in that balance, the future of everyone in the room hung waiting to be decided. The gunshot shattered the winter silence like thunder, echoing off the log walls and reverberating through the valley beyond. For a heartbeat, everyone in the room froze. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixing with the warm scents of pine and wood smoke. Thomas's pearl-handled pistol clattered to the floor, his face white with shock and pain as he clutched his right shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers, staining his expensive shirt. But the wound was clean, a deliberate shot meant to disable, not kill. Gideon lowered the Colt revolver, smoke still curling from its barrel. His expression was grim, but controlled, the face of a man who'd done what was necessary without taking pleasure in it. "Jesus Christ!" Judge Harrison gasped, pressing himself against the wall as if trying to merge with the timber. Reverend Matthews had gone pale as his collar, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Jake Peterson straightened slowly from where he'd thrown himself across the room, his weathered face split by a grin of pure admiration. "Hell of a shot, boss," he said. "Right through the shoulder, clean as you please." Mrs. Garcia, still clutching. Hope on the stairs crossed herself and murmured a prayer of gratitude in rapid Spanish. The baby's cries had stopped, as if the sudden violence had shocked her into silence. "You shot me," Thomas said in disbelief, staring at the blood on his hand. "You actually shot me." "I warned you," Gideon replied calmly, opening the cylinder to eject the spent cartridge. "You drew a weapon in my home and threatened people under my protection. Consider yourself lucky I aimed for your shoulder instead of your heart." The sound of hoofbeats and shouting voices came from outside, ranch hands responding to the gunshot, converging on the main house with the urgency of men accustomed to frontier dangers. "Now then," Gideon continued, snapping the cylinder closed with a decisive click, "I believe we were discussing the authenticity of certain legal documents." Judge Harrison had recovered enough of his composure to examine Thomas's forged marriage certificate with new eyes. Under the circumstances, the flaws that had been subtle before now seemed glaringly obvious. The wrong weight of paper, signatures that didn't quite match, witness names that couldn't be verified. "This is fraudulent," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of years on the bench. "Completely fraudulent. Mr. Whitmore, you're facing serious criminal charges." "You don't understand," Thomas said through gritted teeth, still clutching his wounded shoulder. "I can't go back to Denver empty-handed. The Ashfords, Senator Ashford will destroy me if this scandal comes to light." "Then you should have thought of that before you abandoned a pregnant woman," Maisie said, finding her voice stronger than she'd expected. "Before you forged documents and threatened innocent people." The front door burst open as 3 ranch hands rushed in, guns drawn and ready for trouble. They stopped short at the scene before them, their boss standing calm and controlled with a smoking revolver, a well-dressed stranger bleeding on the floor, and various townspeople looking like they'd seen the wrath of God. "Everything all right, Mr. McAllister?" asked Tom Bradley, the lead hand. "Under control, Tom, though we might need Dr. Morrison to tend to Mr. Whitmore's shoulder, and perhaps someone should ride to town for the sheriff." "The sheriff?" Reverend Matthews found his voice at last. "Surely this is a matter that could be handled more quietly?" Gideon's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Quietly? Like the way you and your friends planned to quietly force Miss Tolland to leave with a man who threatened her at gunpoint." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Judge Harrison shifted uncomfortably, finally beginning to understand how completely they'd been manipulated by Thomas's lies and forged documents. "Now see here," the judge began, but Gideon cut him off. "No, you see here. You came to my home on New Year's Eve with forged papers and threats, ready to tear a mother away from her child based on the word of a man you'd never met. What does that say about your judgment, your commitment to actual justice?" The church bell began to ring then, not the measured tolls of a service, but the urgent clanging that signaled emergency or celebration. Someone in town had heard the gunshot and was raising the alarm, calling the community to witness whatever drama was unfolding at the McAllister ranch. "They'll all come now," Jake observed with satisfaction, Whole damn town'll want to know what happened up here. Thomas struggled to his feet, his face grey with pain and growing panic. You don't understand what you've done. When Senator Ashford finds out about this, Senator Ashford will find out that his daughter was about to marry a forger and a man who threatens women and children, Gideon interrupted. I suspect he'll be grateful to learn the truth before the wedding, don't you? The bell continued its urgent summons, its bronze voice carrying across the snow-covered valley like a call to judgment. In the distance, Maisie could see lights beginning to move along the road from town, lanterns and torches carried by curious neighbors drawn by the sound of gunfire and the promise of answers. The whole community is coming, she realized, a mixture of fear and anticipation in her voice. Good, Gideon said firmly. It's time everyone heard the truth. Within an hour, the front yard of the McAllister ranch looked like a winter festival. Gone wrong. Half the population of Cedar Ridge had made the journey through the snow, drawn by the church bell's urgent summons and the kind of curiosity that only small towns could generate. Lanterns bobbed like fireflies against the darkness, and voices carried on the crisp air as neighbors speculated about what could have brought them all out on New Year's Eve. Dr. Morrison had arrived with the first wave of townspeople, his medical bag in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other. He'd tended to Thomas's shoulder with professional efficiency, pronouncing the wound clean but painful, and recommending that the patient avoid sudden movements for several weeks. Lucky for you, McAllister aimed where he did, the doctor told. Thomas with the dry humor of a man who'd seen plenty of frontier justice. 6 inches to the left, and we'd be having a very different conversation. Sheriff William Garrett arrived with the second wave, his deputy in tow, and his expression suggesting he'd rather be home with his own family than sorting out whatever mess had exploded at the territory's most prominent ranch. But one look at the scene, the wounded stranger, the forged documents, and Gideon's calm explanation told him this was bigger than a simple shooting. So let me understand this, the sheriff said, examining the fraudulent marriage certificate. By lamplight, this fellow shows up with fake papers, threatens Miss Tolland and her baby, pulls a gun in your home, and you shot him in self-defense. That's the simplified version, Gideon confirmed, but accurate. The crowd had gathered in a loose semicircle around the front porch, their breath steaming in the cold air as they listened to the extraordinary tale unfold. Maisie found herself at the center of attention in a way she'd never wanted, but something had changed in her during the confrontation. The fear and shame that had driven her into hiding were still there, but they'd been joined by something stronger. A fierce protectiveness for her daughter and a growing understanding of her own worth. "Is it true?" called out Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife. "Did he really forge marriage papers?" Judge Harrison, looking older and more shaken than anyone had ever seen him, held up the document with obvious disgust. "I'm afraid it is. The signatures are forged. The witnesses are fictitious, and the entire document is fraudulent. I was deceived along with everyone else." A murmur ran through the crowd, surprise, outrage, and something that might have been sympathy for Maisie's situation. These were practical people who understood deception and appreciated honesty, even when it came wrapped in scandal. What about the baby? This from Sarah Coleman, who ran the general store with her husband. "Where's the little one?" As if summoned by the question, Hope chose that moment to announce her presence with a cry that cut through the winter air like a bell. Mrs. Garcia appeared in the doorway. The baby, wrapped in warm blankets, her tiny face red with indignation at being kept awake past her bedtime. The sight of the infant seemed to transform the crowd's mood entirely. Whatever moral complexities the adults had created for themselves, the baby was innocent, deserving of protection and care regardless of the circumstances of her birth. "She's beautiful," someone called out, and Maisie felt tears prick her eyes at the genuine warmth in the voice. Thomas, supported by Dr. Morrison and looking pale but determined, made one final attempt to salvage his plan. "The child is still Mine by blood, he declared, his voice carrying across the yard. I have rights. You have no rights, interrupted a voice from the crowd, and Maisie was shocked to see that it belonged to Mrs. Henderson, her former landlady. The older woman stepped forward, her weathered face set in lines of determination. You abandoned her, Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Left her pregnant and alone in the middle of winter. Cast her out on Christmas Eve like she was nothing more than trash. What kind of man does that to a woman carrying his child? The crowd murmured agreement, and Maisie realized that the story of her eviction had spread through town, creating sympathy where she'd expected only judgment. Mrs. Henderson, she said quietly, I thought a lot of things, the older woman replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Most of them wrong. Can you forgive a foolish old woman? Before Maisie could answer, Hope's cries grew more urgent, demanding attention with the imperious voice of a newborn who knew exactly what she wanted. Maisie took her daughter from Mrs. Garcia, and as she settled the baby against her shoulder, she became aware of the complete silence that had fallen over the crowd. Hope's first cry as a member of this community had been heard and acknowledged. In that moment, she ceased to be a scandal or a complication and became simply what she was, a child who belonged somewhere, protected by people who understood that family was more than blood, more than law, more than the narrow definitions of respectability. The sound of her contentment as she settled against her mother's warmth carried across the snowy yard like a benediction, blessing them all with the promise of new beginnings. You shot me, Thomas said in disbelief, staring at the blood on his hand. You actually shot me. I warned you, Gideon replied calmly, opening the cylinder to eject the spent cartridge. You drew a weapon in my home and threatened people under my protection. Consider yourself lucky I aimed for your shoulder instead of your heart. The sound of hoofbeats and shouting voices came from outside, ranch hands responding to the gunshot, converging on the main house with the urgency of men, accustomed to frontier dangers. Now then, Gideon continued, snapping the cylinder closed with a decisive click. I believe we were discussing the authenticity of certain legal documents. Judge Harrison had recovered enough of his composure to examine Thomas's forged marriage certificate with new eyes. Under the circumstances, the flaws that had been subtle before now seemed glaringly obvious. The wrong weight of paper, signatures that didn't quite match, witness names that couldn't be verified. This is fraudulent, he declared, his voice carrying the authority of years on the bench. Completely fraudulent. Mr. Whitmore, you're facing serious criminal charges. You don't understand, Thomas said through gritted teeth, still clutching his wounded shoulder. I can't go back to Denver empty-handed. The Ashfords. Senator Ashford will destroy me if this scandal comes to light. Then you should have thought of that before you abandoned a pregnant woman, Maisie said, finding her voice stronger than she'd expected. Before you forged documents and threatened innocent people. The front door burst open as 3 ranch hands rushed in, guns drawn and ready for trouble. They stopped short at the scene before them, their boss standing calm and controlled with a smoking revolver, a well-dressed stranger bleeding on the floor, and various townspeople looking like they'd seen the wrath of God. Everything all right, Mr. McAllister? Asked Tom Bradley, the lead hand. Under control, Tom, though we might need Dr. Morrison to tend to Mr. Whitmore's shoulder, and perhaps someone should ride to town for the sheriff. The sheriff? Reverend Matthews found his voice at last. Surely this is a matter that could be handled more quietly? Gideon's laugh was cold as winter wind. Quietly? Like the way you and your friends planned to quietly force Miss Tolland to leave with a man who threatened her at gunpoint. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Judge Harrison shifted uncomfortably, finally beginning to understand how completely they'd been manipulated by Thomas's lies and forged documents. Now see here, the judge began, but Gideon cut him off. No, you see here. You came to my home on New Year's Eve with forged papers and threats, ready to tear a mother away from her child based on the word of a man you'd never met. What does that say about your judgment, your commitment to actual justice? The church. Bell began to ring then, not the measured tolls of a service, but the urgent clanging that signaled emergency or celebration. Someone in town had heard the gunshot and was raising the alarm, calling the community to witness whatever drama was unfolding at the McAllister ranch. "They'll all come now," Jake observed with satisfaction. "Whole damn town'll want to know what happened up here." Thomas struggled to his feet, his face grey with pain and growing panic. "You don't understand what you've done. When Senator Ashford finds out about this, Senator Ashford will find out that his daughter was about to marry a forger and a man who threatens women and children," Gideon interrupted. "I suspect he'll be grateful to learn the truth before the wedding, don't you?" The bell continued its urgent summons, its bronze voice carrying across the snow-covered valley like a call to judgment. In the distance, Maisie could see lights beginning to move along the road from town, lanterns and torches carried by curious neighbors drawn by the sound of gunfire and the promise of answers. "The whole community is coming," she realized, a mixture of fear and anticipation in her voice. "Good," Gideon said firmly. "It's time everyone heard the truth." Within an hour, the front yard of the McAllister ranch looked like a winter festival. Gone wrong. Half the population of Cedar Ridge had made the journey through the snow, drawn by the church bell's urgent summons and the kind of curiosity that only small towns could generate. Lanterns bobbed like fireflies against the darkness, and voices carried on the crisp air as neighbors speculated about what could have brought them all out on New Year's Eve. Dr. Morrison had arrived with the first wave of townspeople, his medical bag in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other. He tended to Thomas's shoulder with professional efficiency, pronouncing the wound clean but painful, and recommending that the patient avoid sudden movements for several weeks. "Lucky for you, McAllister aimed where he did," the doctor told. Thomas with the dry humor of a man who'd seen plenty of frontier justice. 6 inches to the left, and we'd be having a very different conversation. Sheriff William Garrett arrived with the second wave, his deputy in tow, and his expression suggesting he'd rather be home with his own family than sorting out whatever mess had exploded at the territory's most prominent ranch. But one look at the scene, the wounded stranger, the forged documents, and Gideon's calm explanation told him this was bigger than a simple shooting. "So let me understand this," the sheriff said, examining the fraudulent marriage certificate. "By lamplight, this fellow shows up with fake papers, threatens Miss Tolland and her baby, pulls a gun in your home, and you shot him in self-defense." "That's the simplified version," Gideon confirmed, "but accurate." The crowd had gathered in a loose semicircle around the front porch, their breath steaming in the cold air as they listened to the extraordinary tale unfold. Maisie found herself at the center of attention in a way she'd never wanted, but something had changed in her during the confrontation. The fear and shame that had driven her into hiding were still there, but they'd been joined by something stronger, a fierce protectiveness for her daughter and a growing understanding of her own worth. "Is it true?" called out Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife. "Did he really forge marriage papers?" Judge Harrison, looking older and more shaken than anyone had ever seen him, held up the document with obvious disgust. "I'm afraid it is. The signatures are forged. The witnesses are fictitious, and the entire document is fraudulent. I was deceived along with everyone else." A murmur ran through the crowd, surprise, outrage, and something that might have been sympathy for Maisie's situation. These were practical people who understood deception and appreciated honesty, even when it came wrapped in scandal. "What about the baby?" This from Sarah Coleman, who ran the general store with her husband. "Where's the little one?" As if summoned by the question, Hope chose that moment to announce her presence with a cry that cut through the winter air like a bell. Mrs. Garcia appeared in the doorway. The baby, wrapped in warm blankets, her tiny face red with indignation at being kept awake past her bedtime. The sight of the infant seemed to transform the crowd's mood entirely. Whatever moral complexities the adults had created for themselves, the baby was innocent, deserving of protection and care regardless of the circumstances of her birth. "She's beautiful," someone called out, and Maisie felt tears prick her eyes at the genuine warmth in the voice. Thomas, supported by Dr. Morrison and looking pale but determined, made one final attempt to salvage his plan. "The child is still mine by blood," he declared, his voice carrying across the yard. "I have rights." "You have no rights," interrupted a voice from the crowd, and Maisie was shocked to see that it belonged to Mrs. Henderson, her former landlady. The older woman stepped forward, her weathered face set in lines of determination. "You abandoned her," Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Left her pregnant and alone in the middle of winter. Cast her out on Christmas Eve like she was nothing more than trash. What kind of man does that to a woman carrying his child?" The crowd murmured agreement, and Maisie realized that the story of her eviction had spread through town, creating sympathy where she'd expected only judgment. "Mrs. Henderson," she said quietly, I thought a lot of things," the older woman replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Most of them wrong. Can you forgive a foolish old woman?" Before Maisie could answer, Hope's cries grew more urgent, demanding attention with the imperious voice of a newborn who knew exactly what she wanted. Maisie took her daughter from Mrs. Garcia, and as she settled the baby against her shoulder, she became aware of the complete silence that had fallen over the crowd. Hope's first cry as a member of this community had been heard and acknowledged. In that moment, she ceased to be a scandal or a complication and became simply what she was. A child who belonged somewhere, protected by people who understood that family was more than blood, more than law, more than the narrow definitions of respectability. The sound of her contentment as she settled against her mother's warmth carried across the snowy yard like a benediction, blessing them all with the promise of new beginnings. Spring came early to Colorado Territory that year, arriving in March with the kind of gentle warmth that made winter seem like a distant memory. The snow that had blanketed the McAllister ranch for months melted into rushing streams that sang their way down the mountainsides, carrying with them the promise of new growth and fresh beginnings. Maisie stood in the doorway of the main house, watching Gideon work with a young colt in the circular training pen. Hope, now 4 months old and growing stronger every day, gurgled contentedly in her arms, her dark eyes tracking her father's movements with the focused attention that babies reserved for the most important people in their world. "Father." The word still felt new on Maisie's tongue, but it fit Gideon as naturally as his worn leather gloves fit his hands. He'd taken to fatherhood with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else, changing diapers with the same careful attention he used to examine cattle, singing lullabies in his deep voice that could soothe Hope when nothing else would. Work. The events of New Year's Eve felt like something from another lifetime now. Thomas Whitmore had been taken into custody by Sheriff Garrett, facing charges of forgery, fraud, and assault with a deadly weapon. Word had reached them through Jake's trips to town that the scandal had indeed reached Denver, where Senator Ashford had publicly terminated his daughter's engagement and launched his own investigation into Thomas's business dealings. Justice. As a way of finding men like that, Gideon had observed when the news arrived. Sometimes it just takes a while to catch up. The community's response had been the most surprising change of all. Far from the judgment and ostracism Maisie had feared, she'd found herself embraced by neighbors who seemed determined to make up for their earlier coldness. Mrs. Henderson visited twice a week, bringing fresh bread and stories about the other. Young mothers in town. Dr. Morrison had declared Hope the healthiest baby in 3 counties and refused to accept payment for his services. Even Reverend Matthews had undergone a transformation, delivering a sermon about mercy and second chances that had left half the congregation in tears. "People want to do right," Mrs. Garcia had explained, as they watched the parade of visitors bringing gifts for the baby. "Sometimes they just need someone to show them how." But the most significant change had happened 3 weeks ago, when Gideon had finally unlocked the nursery door. Maisie had found him standing in the doorway one morning, his father's wooden cross in his hand, staring at the room that had been sealed for 3 years. Dust motes danced in the spring sunlight, streaming through windows that hadn't been opened since his wife's death, and every surface was covered with the accumulated neglect of grief held too long. "I think it's time," he'd said simply, and together they'd begun the process of transforming the space from a shrine to the past into a sanctuary for the future. The wooden rocking horse had been the hardest thing to move. Hand-carved by Gideon's father for the grandchild he'd never meet, it bore the weight of dreams that had died before they could be born. But as they cleaned and polished its painted surface, hope had reached out from Maisie's arms to touch its carved mane, and something in that gesture had transformed it from a symbol of loss into a promise of joy to come. Now the nursery was alive, with color and light, fresh paint on the walls, new curtains at the windows, and Hope's crib positioned to catch the morning sun. The rocking horse stood in the corner, no longer gathering dust, but waiting for the day when small hands would guide it on imaginary adventures. A soft knock on the doorframe interrupted Maisie's reverie. She turned to find Gideon approaching, his work clothes dusty, and his face bearing the satisfied expression of a man who'd accomplished something meaningful. "How's our girl?" he asked, reaching out to stroke Hope's cheek with one gentle finger. "Perfect," Maisie replied, meaning it. "Just like her father." Gideon's smile was the kind that started in his eyes and spread across his entire face. "I've been thinking," he said, pulling something from his pocket. What emerged made Maisie's breath catch. It was a ring, not the elaborate diamond confection that wealthy men typically offered their wives, but a simple gold band that gleamed with honest beauty. The metal was warm from his pocket, shaped by hands that understood the value of things built to last. "It's not much," Gideon said, suddenly uncertain. "Nothing like what a woman of your beauty deserves. But it's real, and it's offered with everything. I have to give." Maisie felt tears prick her eyes as she recognized the significance of the moment. Not just a proposal, but an invitation to become part of something larger than herself. A family, a legacy, a home built on love rather than obligation. "Maisie Tolland," Gideon continued, dropping to one knee right there in the doorway, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because society expects it, not because it's convenient, but because I can't imagine my life without you and Hope in it." Hope chose that moment to reach out toward the shining ring, her tiny fingers grasping at the light it reflected. Her delighted gurgle seemed to echo across the ranch, blessing the moment with the pure joy that only children could provide. "Yes," Maisie whispered, then louder. "Yes. Of course, yes." As Gideon slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, Maisie thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The cold Christmas Eve, when she'd nearly died in the snow, the kindness of strangers that had become love, the community that had learned to see past scandal to the truth beneath. Years later, when Hope was old enough to understand, they would tell her the story of how she came to be born on the coldest night of the year, when mercy wore the face of a lonely rancher, and love arrived wrapped in the darkest moments. They would tell her about the wooden rocking horse that waited 3 years for the right child to love it, about the great hearth that warmed more than just bodies, and about the simple gold ring that promised forever. But mostly, they would tell her that some of the best families are the ones you choose, built not on the accidents of blood, but on the deliberate decision to love and protect and cherish what matters most. The legend of their Christmas miracle would be passed down through winter fires for generations to come, not a story of angels or lights, but of ordinary people who chose extraordinary kindness when the world demanded judgment. And in a small church in Cedar Ridge, where a brass bell still called the faithful to witness truth, their names would be recorded in the marriage register, with the notation that would become their legacy: united by love, blessed by mercy, and sealed by hope.